You clumsy fool! Look at this mess you've made! Get it out of my way!
So sorry, madame. Please don't fire me.
Please. This is his mistake. First time. Don't firing him, madam. You should know where you stand.
But she don't know everything she have will gone soon. Let we go back to the beginning. The private dining room on the top floor of Whitmore Tower was designed to make ordinary people feel instantly small the moment they stepped across its threshold. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls opened up a panoramic view of a brilliant Manhattan below, glittering like a massive jewelry box spilled across the heart of New York. Every surface in this space exuded wealth. Rare marble tables, polished to a mirror shine, tiered crystal chandeliers reflecting light like morning dew, and hand-woven linen napkins meticulously folded into the shapes of proud swans. It was all arranged with a single purpose, to remind the guests exactly where they stood in the world's hierarchy of power. Tonight, the room hosted 22 of the city's most powerful figures, gathered at the personal invitation of a man who never extended an invitation lightly or without purpose. The tycoon Ethan Whitmore. The air was thick with the scent of fresh magnolia, blended with the luxury of raw ambition, as low laughter and the gentle clinking of champagne glasses created the exclusive ambient track of the upper class. In stark contrast to the lavish noise and calculated diplomatic handshakes outside, behind the soundproof double doors of stainless steel lay a world of fire, metal, and in concentration so absolute it bordered on the extreme. Maya Johnson stood at the center prep station of the massive kitchen, her body perfectly still while her hands moved with fluid grace. She wore a pristine white chef's jacket, pressed flat without a single crease, her naturally curly dark hair tightly bundled beneath a thick cloth cap. If anyone happened to pass her on the busy streets of New York, or even within this sprawling kitchen, they probably would not look twice. She did not carry the arrogance of someone who demanded the crowd's attention. Maya moved through her workspace with precision and calm, like a conductor directing a silent yet commanding symphony. She dipped a small silver-plated spoon into a gently simmering reduction, tasting it as her eyes narrowed with sharp vigilance. A pinch of Malden sea salt was dropped in, a micro-adjustment made entirely on practiced instinct, the kind of instinct no prestigious culinary academy could ever teach a student unless they possessed a soul deeply sensitive to flavor. Beside her, pan-seared sea bass reached absolute perfection, its crispy skin catching the overhead lights like a piece of ancient cast bronze. She let the fish rest for exactly 45 seconds before plating. Maya did not need loud applause or public validation. She only required her food to reach perfection, and the reality was that her food always did. Maya Johnson always remembered the early days of learning to cook as a teenager in her grandmother's small, weathered kitchen in rural Georgia. The rule there was simple but harsh. Her grandmother used to look her dead in the eye and say that either you learn how to make something worth putting in a person's mouth, or you wash dishes for the rest of your life. Maya learned fast, driven by the pride of a young black woman growing up in a society riddled with invisible barriers. By the age of 22, she had worked in 3 Michelin-starred restaurants, accepted an apprenticeship under a legendary French chef in Lyon, and built a unique personal culinary philosophy, combining the depth of Southern American comfort food with classical European technique and the discreet complexity of West African spices. Her food was not just sustenance. It knew how to tell a story. It made people pause mid-bite, set their forks down, and stare into the void, the way people often do when trying to hold on to a genuine emotion or a deep, distant memory. Chief. A prominent food critic had once written about her in the New York Times that you remember a dish by Maya Johnson the way you remember the first moment you understood something profoundly true about life. Maya had cut that article out and framed it carefully, but only a week later, she quietly took it down. She was not the kind of woman who needed to look at her own reflection or rely on the praise of others to find her value in existence. The professional bond between her and the tycoon, Ethan Whitmore, began 7 years ago. Chief, a turning point that completely altered the trajectory of her career. At the time, she was hired as a temporary chef to prepare a private dinner for Ethan, whose palate was rumored to be hopelessly unappeasable and notoriously eccentric. Many renowned chefs before her had been fired within their first week, some dismissed after a single dish, because Ethan Whitmore did not eat for mere pleasure. He ate with the strict attention of a man who had encountered excellence in too many fields not to recognize its absence instantly. Maya heard all those panicked warnings from her peers and quietly set them aside. She did not cook to please a wealthy, difficult man. She cooked to satisfy her own standards, and her standards were higher than most people's in the world. During that fateful dinner 7 years ago, Ethan sent back the first plate untouched. He said nothing about the second. But after the third course, a slow braised beef short rib with veg reduction and a faint, fleeting whisper of smoked cardamom, Ethan stood up from the table, walked the long distance to the kitchen door, and knocked. When Maya opened it, the powerful man looked at her for a long moment and said that she was the only one who understood the true meaning of balance. The next morning, his assistant called with an exclusive contract containing the most generous terms. For 7 years, she was never asked to cook for anyone else but Ethan, and she preferred it that way. Ethan Whitmore was demanding, but he was honest, fair, and treated her work with a reverence that most people reserved only for fine art. Tonight, the circumstances were unusual enough to require Maya's presence at the Zenith Dining Hall inside the tower, instead of Ethan's familiar private residence. The executive chef in charge of official events had called out due to a sudden family crisis just 2 hours before the banquet was set to begin. The dinner party had been scheduled for 3 months with 22 VIP guests. The 6-course menu was firmly locked, and the expensive ingredients had already been paid for. Ethan's assistant had called Maya in a state of sheer panic when no replacement could be found. It took Maya exactly 2 minutes of thought before agreeing to step into the game. She was not being asked to abandon her standards. She was being asked to maintain them under a crushing pressure of time and reputation. She arrived quickly, reorganized the disoriented kitchen staff, personally tasted every sauce, and by exactly 7 o'clock, everything was operating with the smooth efficiency of a well-maintained clockwork engine. Not a single guest outside knew about this sudden staffing change. No one asked, and no one thought to ask, because to them, perfection was a baseline expectation at Whitmore Tower. The service staff on the floor knew exactly who Maya was, and they moved around her with the cautious respect of people who understood that the person at the center of everything does not need to be the loudest voice in the room. The kitchen maintained its sacred stillness until the first dish was carried out. A sleek, glossy black limousine pulled up smoothly in front of the main entrance of Whitmore Tower, the Manhattan streetlights reflecting off its lacquer like a mobile mirror. The driver, wearing white gloves, quickly stepped down, walked to the rear, and opened the door with a textbook motion without a single flaw. The woman stepped out of the car, slowly, deliberately, with the demeanor of someone who had long ago decided that the surrounding world must adjust its speed to wait for her. She wore a premium cream silk blazer draped over a soft satin shirt, her blonde hair pulled high and sleekly pinned, emphasizing the sharp, angular, and somewhat ruthless features of her impeccably made-up white face. This was Victoria Hale, 41 years old, the founder and CEO of Hale Ventures, one of the largest and most aggressively expanding private real estate development firms on the East Coast. From the moment she crossed the threshold of Whitmore Tower, she began to evaluate everything around her with the cold, appraising gaze she normally reserved for impoverished neighborhoods she was considering demolishing to erect soaring skyscrapers. Victoria Hale had built her empire through a combination of innate business acumen and a personality that had never been praised by anyone as warm or compassionate. She grew up in an old-money aristocratic family, inheriting not just wealth, but a rigid system of hierarchical thinking. She had multiplied that fortune many times over, and from that had arrived at an unquestioned belief. Her wealth and her race were not a mere circumstance of luck, but a supreme verdict proving her innate superiority over the rest of the world. She was not malicious in a way that required conscious effort to inflict pain on others. Her cruelty was of a lazier, more sustainable kind. She simply did not view the people who served her as complete human beings with emotions and dignity. Maid, driver, butler, kitchen staff. To Victoria's mind, this was a category of biological tools existing solely to execute a specific function. When they did well, she ignored them the way one ignores a smoothly running air conditioner. But when they botched even a minor detail, she was entirely ready to express her dissatisfaction without restraint or hesitation, because throughout her entire life, she had never faced a single consequence for doing so. Tonight, Victoria Hale arrived at Whitmore Tower with high expectations of solidifying and signing a multi-billion-dollar mixed-use real estate development deal with Ethan Whitmore. She was confident in her position because she was always confident in the power of money. She entered the private dining room and paused at the doorway for a few seconds, surveying the space with the expression of someone who had been promised a great deal and was warily handing down a final judgment. She let her coat slide off her shoulders naturally without looking back, knowing with absolute certainty that the hands of a waiting server would catch the expensive garment with utmost care. She moved toward the center of the room, passing groups of early arrivals who turned to greet her with the calculated warmth of people who understood that tonight's room was packed with figures worth knowing. Victoria accepted these social gestures effortlessly out of long habit, smiling just enough, saying the right things, and positioning herself with the precision of a queen on patrol. The incident that shattered that flawless atmosphere began at the edge of the room, right near the entrance of the service corridor, where the light from the crystal chandeliers was a bit dimmer. Marcus, 20-year-old black server, who had only been on the job for 3 weeks and was doing his absolute best not to make a mistake under the pressure of the high society banquet, suddenly lost his balance on a slightly uneven patch of carpet. A mistake left by the logistics team. He was carrying a silver tray of sparkling mineral water, tea. The young man regained his footing instantly through a massive effort, and the tray did not spill, but a few effervescent drops of water splashed out, landing near the heel of Victoria Hale's expensive suede shoes. Marcus turned to her, his face filled with genuine panic and deep apology, his dark skin turning pale with fear. He bowed low and said in a voice, heavy with sincere remorse, that he was incredibly sorry, ma'am. He absolutely did not mean to do it. Victoria cut him off before he could even finish his sentence, her voice not particularly loud, but carrying a cold contempt that caused the surrounding conversations to halt abruptly like a snapped tape. She asked Marcus if he had any idea how much those shoes cost, and asserted that his clumsiness was unacceptable, adding that people who could not manage a basic task like carrying a tray probably should not manage anything in their lives. Marcus stood frozen in place, his hands gripping the edge of the silver tray so tightly his knuckles turned white. He swallowed his deep humiliation under the curious and cold stares of the wealthy white guests around him. Maya Johnson, was standing near the kitchen entrance, checking the progress of the courses when she heard the sudden shift in the emotional temperature of the dining room. She had been in enough high-pressure environments to read the temperature of a space from a great distance. She walked over calmly, her pace measured, and smoothly stepped into the space between Victoria Hale and Marcus like a natural shield. She looked directly into Victoria's sharp eyes and said, with absolute composure, that she apologized for this disruption in her experience tonight, assuring her that the service would proceed without further error and that this staff member would be reassigned immediately. Her tone was professional, clear, and completely devoid of any subservience or fear. She did not bow her head, but was managing the situation as the master of her own space. Victoria looked at Maya for the first time in her life, her gaze moving from the black chef's resolute face down to her white jacket, lingering on her unwavering posture and strange stillness. It caused a slight irritation in Victoria's mind. She said nothing more, but as Maya turned back toward the kitchen, Victoria's eyes followed her with that signature blend of class and racial prejudice, whispering loudly enough for those around her to hear that that was exactly where people like her belonged, in the kitchen. The first 5 courses of the dinner proceeded beautifully and smoothly, like a natural flow of high culinary art. Maya Johnson had designed a menu that moved through textures and flavors with the controlled momentum of a well-told story using the language of food. From the cold appetizer of compressed melon with premium prosciutto to a cream soup so smooth it felt like silk dissolving on the tongue. Compliments were continuously sent back from the dining room through the servers, who relayed them into the kitchen with the quiet satisfaction of people who knew they were part of something excellent and authentic. Maya acknowledged each compliment with a slight nod and immediately refocused her entire mind on the next dish. The 6th course, the main event of the banquet, was a New Zealand herb-crusted lamb that Maya had spent most of 2 weeks perfecting in her private lab. She sourced the lamb from a small, trusted farm, developed a unique technique to press a crust of herbs and spices onto the meat's surface, and paired it with a smooth white bean puree and a rich lamb jus that had been slowly, meticulously reduced over 48 hours to achieve its depth of flavor. She personally plated every dish with absolute care, ensuring that the 20-second plate was as flawless and cinematically beautiful as the first one sent out. The dining room received the main course with a strange silence. The kind of silence that is itself the greatest applause for a chef when diners are completely focused on savoring the flavor. But that sacred quiet was violently broken from a table near the center of the room where Victoria Hale was sitting with her partners. She set her silver fork down on the crystal plate with a sharp, intentional clack against the rim, dabbed her linen napkin lightly against her lips, and looked around the table with blatant dissatisfaction. She spoke loudly, stating that the lamb was far too salty, that this kind of seasoning was a sign of severe inexperience, and that a kitchen like this should not be serving in a room of this caliber. A man sitting across from her, veteran real estate developer who had known Victoria for years, continued eating his meat and spoke up in disagreement, noting that, on the contrary, he found the seasoning unique and delicate. But Victoria completely ignored his opinion, pushing her plate forward half an inch, the ultimate gesture of rejection, and raised her hand for a server. She declared coldly that she did not want feedback relayed indirectly. She wanted to speak directly to the person responsible for this dish. Right here, in front of everyone, Maya Johnson walked out of the kitchen with the same measured pace and ordinary composure upon receiving the request from the dining floor supervisor. She approached Victoria Hale's table without the slightest hint of haste, introduced herself simply by her first name, and asked how she could assist with her experience tonight. Victoria looked at her, then at the rest of the table with a faint, superior smile, and began a detailed, escalating critique of the dish intentionally using harsh language to humiliate the black chef in front of the crowd. She asserted that the presentation was cluttered, the sauce heavy, and that this kitchen was degrading the value of a high society event. Maya stood listening to the entire lengthy speech without interrupting once or changing her expression, her professional attention directed toward the speaker. When Victoria concluded with a challenging stare, Maya said gently that she understood her concerns about the flavor and would be more than happy to personally prepare a different dish if the lamb was not to her liking tonight. She offered a perfect alternative solution according to five-star service standards. She did not make excuses, argue, or beg for forgiveness, because she knew full well her dish was not flawed. It was precisely this steady composure, this refusal to be made small by a black woman, that detonated the fury mistaken for supreme power in Victoria Hale's mind. Victoria stood up abruptly from her chair, the heavy furniture shifting slightly on the floor. She spoke loudly, saying she did not want a different dish, but what she wanted was for someone to admit that this food was below basic standards. She pointed a finger laden with an expensive diamond ring straight at Maya's chest, her outstretched hand trembling with an uncontrollable rage. Maya stood completely motionless. She did not step back to show fear, nor did she step forward to threaten. She simply held Victoria's gaze with eyes as still as a winter lake, a stillness carrying the weight of self-respect and the proud lineage of Southern American women who had survived the upheavals of history. The entire dining room fell completely silent. Every conversation stopped, and 22 of the city's most powerful people turned to witness the confrontation between two classes. Then, in a brief, uncontrolled flash of rage, Victoria Hale's right hand moved in an arc, short, sharp, and fast enough to shock. A crisp, ruthless snap echoed, rebounding off the marble walls of the 42nd floor dining hall. Maya Johnson's head snapped to the side for a fraction of a second from the force of the slap, but not a single person in the room moved or spoke up to intervene. A thick complicity of silence blanketed the space. Then, with a deliberate slowness, Maya turned her face back to the center. The expression on her face did not crumble. She did not raise her hand to cup her left cheek, where the skin was gradually reddening. She did not cry, and she did not say a word. She simply continued to look straight into Victoria Hale's panting eyes with her original, unwavering stillness. In that stillness, there was no explosive hatred, but a spiritual power that everyone in the room could feel pressing down on the space, unable to be named. Victoria stood with her hand dangling at her side, a strange expression flitting across her face as she realized that the silence of the room now carried a completely different quality than it had a few seconds ago. It was no longer agreement with her power, but stunned shock at an act of brute violence. She quickly regained her aristocratic demeanor, adjusted her cream blazer, tilted her chin, and spoke as if handing down a final verdict, saying that she should know exactly where her place was in this world. She then turned to the floor supervisor, demanding the highest manager be brought out because this woman needed to be thrown out of the tower immediately. Maya looked at Victoria for a long moment, took one small step closer, and lowered her voice to a register where those at the nearest table had to lean in just to hear. She asked Victoria if she was absolutely certain she wanted to continue this tonight, a measured question that created a strange vacuum in the dining room. Ethan Whitmore walked into the private dining room of the 42nd floor at that exact moment of tension. The presence of this 54-year-old man did not require loud announcements or a large escort. He was a man whose presence simply arrived like a massive shift in atmospheric pressure before a major storm. He wore a dark, hand-tailored suit that fit perfectly, and the absence of a tie lent him an easy yet commanding demeanor. His eyes were narrow, deep, and held a highly vigilant intelligence that made most people feel completely transparent rather than merely seen when he looked at them. He had arrived 40 minutes earlier than his scheduled appearance at the dinner because the meeting downtown had concluded faster than anticipated. Chief, he had received no prior information about the incident before stepping out of his private elevator and walking down the hallway leading to the dining room. The room registered his arrival within 3 seconds. Strained conversations immediately paused and self-structured around the presence of the tower's owner. A few powerful guests stood up to welcome him with extended hands and familiar diplomatic smiles, but Ethan moved past them with an efficiency that was never rude. He acknowledged each person with a short nod, but his gaze went beyond them, moving deep into the room to measure the emotional temperature of the space. He instantly recognized the unnatural stillness near the center tables, noted the controlled anxiety on the faces of his senior staff, and finally, his gaze locked onto Maya Johnson. She was standing 6 feet away from Victoria Hale in a posture of perfect control, but on her left cheek was a glaring red mark, an unmistakable imprint of shape, cause, and meaning against her skin. Ethan Whitmore stopped in his tracks. The guests following behind him halted instinctively. The room went silent in a way it never had before. He did not raise his voice or show anger on his face. He merely asked a single question in the flat tone of a man asking a question to which he already knew the answer. Who did this? A long moment stretched in the terrifying silence. Not a single guest dared to answer. They looked at their hands or their water glasses to avoid the tycoon's gaze. Maya looked at him, but she held true to her professional principles and did not explain the situation herself. Then, the dining floor supervisor took half a step forward, bowed his head, and described precisely and concisely everything that had transpired, from Victoria Hale's complaint about the lamb to the moment she swung her hand to slap Maya in front of the entire dining room. As the supervisor concluded his report, Ethan Whitmore looked straight into Maya's eyes. She met his gaze and nodded once to confirm the truth of the words just spoken, without adding a single emotional statement. Ethan's face did not contort or crumble with anger. It simply became cold, completely and absolutely cold, the way deep water under the ocean turns freezing in a place that has never seen sunlight. He turned around to look directly into Victoria Hale's face, which was trying to maintain a semblance of confidence. Victoria took a small step forward, still living in the illusion of the power of money and a shared upper-class alliance. She offered a social smile and said that he had arrived just in time, adding that she was sorry for this minor disruption during dinner, but this kitchen girl needed to be taught a lesson about professional service, because she was just a cook, after all. Ethan Whitmore let those words settle into the silent space for a few seconds, and then he spoke, a single word, complete and ironclad, no. He did not explain immediately, letting that word hold the entire dining room before continuing in a measured voice, so clear that each word felt like a hammer blow deciding the fate of the person opposite him. He declared before all 22 guests that he wanted to tell them exactly who Maya Johnson was in this world. For the past 7 years, she had not been an ordinary service employee, but the sole architect of every meal he ate at his private residence. Every strategic dinner meeting, every important personal occasion, every morning he started a workday. What was on his plate was never merely food, but the product of care, extraordinary skill, and a noble soul. He emphasized that Maya had prepared meals for 3 heads of state when they visited the city at his personal invitation, that she had been invited to executive chef positions at 2 of the most prestigious restaurants in Europe and had declined both to maintain her professional commitment to him. She was, without debate, the most talented culinary expert he had ever encountered in a lifetime that had granted him access to many excellent people around the globe. Tonight, she had agreed to appear here as a personal favor to him and the tower's staff to manage this entire dinner with only a single day's notice. And the quality of every dish they ate tonight was entirely her own achievement. Ethan took a step closer to Victoria, his voice dropping low but echoing throughout the room, stating that in 7 years he had never allowed anyone to disrespect those who worked for him with devotion, and this was absolutely not the occasion for him to start permitting it. Victoria Hale's face underwent 3 distinct expressions within 30 short box seconds. From arrogant confidence to utter confusion, and then to something that began as denial and gradually turned into genuine fear as she realized the social fabric of the evening had completely shifted with the speed and finality of a ruthlessly turning tide. The powerful guests who had sat at her table, who had laughed and promised joint ventures with her, now turned their faces away in unison, not a single one looking her in the eye to signal an open withdrawal of support. Rumors began to circulate through the room with unstoppable momentum as guests began to quietly compare notes from the past. Stories of how Victoria treated her subordinates ruthlessly were revived in whispers around the banquet tables, and the professional math of the room was completely upended before dessert was even served. Ethan Whitmore flatly announced that all ongoing negotiations and joint project development agreements with Hale Ventures would be suspended immediately to review the firm's partner eligibility. Within the next hour, 2 other major corporations represented at the table also announced similar halts in their commercial talks with Victoria's firm. A ruthless economic and social punishment executed without violence, relying solely on the weight of a decision born of fairness. Victoria Hale stood alone in the marble hallway outside the private dining room as the evening drew to a close. Chief. She understood with physical clarity that the multi-billion-dollar meeting and agreement she had spent months preparing for would never happen again. She had spent years building a version of herself almost immune to consequences through the power of money, and tonight she realized she had miscalculated disastrously. She turned back toward the kitchen where Maya Johnson was standing near the service entrance, overseeing the staff as they finished the final cleanup of the banquet. Victoria approached with a completely altered gait, no longer a precise, conceited stride, but an effortful caution. She stood a short distance away from Maya and called her name in a voice bearing the rhythm of someone forced to read words they understood intellectually were mandatory in this situation. She said she owed Maya an apology, that what she did tonight was wrong, and that she hoped she could accept it to close the matter. Maya Johnson turned around, looking straight into the white woman's eyes for a long moment without any explosive malice or anger. She spoke with an unmistakable honesty, stating that she had heard what she said, and she had been in enough rooms of the upper class long enough to know the difference between someone who truly regretted what they had done and someone who merely regretted the consequences and economic losses that behavior caused them. She knew Victoria belonged to the second category. Maya stepped half an inch closer, her gaze holding Victoria's look so she could not look away. She continued in a low but weighty voice, stating that what happened tonight was not merely a physical slap, but everything that took place before it. Every silent dismissal, every contemptuous whisper at the edge of the room, every moment a human being was treated as lesser merely because of their skin color or the work they did to make a living. None of that was something a single apology offered in the aftershock of economic consequences had the power to repair or erase easily. She shared that she had known since she was very young the heartbreaking feeling of entering a room full of wealthy white people and having her value decided before she could even open her mouth to speak a word. And she had learned over many years how to carry that painful understanding without letting her soul be made small or distorted by hatred. She had worked hard with all the love and respect she possessed for her profession, refusing to let the limiting ceilings of others become her own, since she had arrived at a place where no history of trauma showed on her surface because she chose to let her work speak every single day without needing permission or validation from anyone who hadn't earned the right to give it through their kindness. Therefore, she would take the time she needed to make a choice about forgiveness, and it would not be tonight, in a room still raw under the kind of pressure that produced diplomatic performances rather than internal truths. Victoria Hale stood still for a long moment after hearing Maya's words. Something complex and profound moved across her face, something that, given enough time and privacy, might develop into a genuine understanding of human worth. But if that were to happen, it would be elsewhere, in a different room on a different night, not here under the lights of Whitmore Tower. She nodded once and turned toward the exit, disappearing into the waiting elevator to go down into the city where the Manhattan night continued without her powerful presence. The grand dining room settled into a different kind of quiet. Ethan Whitmore stood at the head of the banquet table and did something that, to those who knew his cold nature well, was the most remarkable act of the night. He stopped a server walking past and spoke loudly enough for the entire room to hear, stating that he wanted to invite the true chef of the banquet to step out. When Maya Johnson emerged from the service corridor in her familiar, pristine white jacket, she looked at the room and the room looked at her. Then, from the table of the Zurich banker, the first applause began to build, quickly spreading across the entire space like an unstoppable tide. Every single guest rose to their feet to pay a rare and genuine tribute, the honor reserved for an outstanding talent and a complete, unyielding dignity that could not be conquered by class violence. Maya accepted the recognition with a slight nod and a measured smile. Chief. She did not seek the center of the room to enjoy the spotlight longer than social courtesy required. She thanked the guests and thanked Ethan briefly, then turned back through the service door to return to her world behind the scenes. In the kitchen, where the heat had finally dissipated, she walked over to stand beside Marcus, the young server, who was still quietly packing away the silver trays with sorrow lingering in his eyes. Maya placed a warm hand on his shoulder and told him that his composure and patience tonight were extraordinary, that he had done an excellent job, and to always be proud of himself because no one had the right to make him feel small unless he allowed them to do so. When the final wiping down concluded and the young staff had departed, the kitchen entered its perfect silence. Maya hung her chef's jacket on the hook inside the door and changed into the ordinary dark coat she had worn on her way here. She picked up her personal bag and stood still for a moment to look at the empty workspace where the stainless steel surfaces reflected the soft light of the security lamps. A place that, to her, was always a sanctuary of authentic creativity. She took the service elevator down to the ground floor and stepped out onto the street, where the New York night air blew cool against her face, making her silently feel that this world was far larger and more forgiving than what had been displayed inside the luxurious dining room an hour ago. She did not call a car immediately, choosing instead to walk a short distance on the pavement, looking up at the illuminated windows of the tower above her, where the final applause had faded and the evening had officially closed. She was here on the sidewalk in her ordinary dark coat, a symbol to no one and a lesson to no one, just Maya Johnson, 32 years old, who had woken up in the morning and done her job better than most people on earth and was now taking her time walking home. A person's true status is not born from the size of the dining room they sit in, from their innate skin color, or from the numbers in their bank account. It is built sustainably through the years of ordinary days, through the continuous application of care, love, and high skill into work that most of the world never sees. Dignity is something that exists before the room is full, and it remains completely intact after the room is entirely empty. It always belongs completely to the person who has chosen to live inside it with all the steadfastness of their soul.